Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13. I want to begin reading with verse 24. I'll read through verse 30, and then we'll skip over and read verses 36 through 42. Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13. Verses 24 through 30, and then verses 36 through 43. Another parable he put forth unto them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is likened unto a man which sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat, and went his way. But when the blade was sprung up and brought forth fruit, then appeared the tares also. So the servants of the householder came and said unto him, Sir, did not thou sow good seed in the field? From whence then hath it tares? He said unto them, An enemy hath done this. The servants said unto him, Wilt thou then that we go and gather them up? But he said, Nay, lest while you gather up the tares, you root up also the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And in the time of harvest I will say to the reapers, Gather ye together first the tares, and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. And then later the disciples came to Jesus and asked him to interpret that parable. In verse 36, then Jesus sent the multitude away and went into the house, and his disciples came unto him, saying, Declare unto us the parable of the tares of the field. He answered and said unto him, He that sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. The enemy that sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the world, and the reapers are the angels. As therefore the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so shall it be in the end of this world. The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity, and shall cast them into a furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then shall the righteous shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Who hath ears to hear, let him hear. Some time ago, I received in the mail a New York Times book review, and I noticed on the very front page the main book that they were reviewing for this particular issue. I was caught first by the title of the book. The title is, Why Did the Heavens Not Darken? And that caught my attention, and I wanted to read what the book was about. The book is not a religious book. It's not a Christian book. It is a historical book in a sense, but it is written about the Holocaust during the World War II. The author is trying to determine the causes in the hearts of men and in society that would cause such a thing to happen. But here's what they say. Given the enormity of the crimes perpetrated by Nazi Germany during World War II, the title of this new book raises a question that many people will have asked themselves as they remember and try to comprehend the Holocaust. Our task would be less difficult and agonizing if the heavens had actually darkened. Since they did not, we must search for the roots of that somewhere else. Now, what interests me in that is that the man writing this book is not a professing Christian. He is not writing a book about religion. He is not even writing a book about God and what he does or does not do. But this man entitles his book, Why Did the Heavens Not Darken? In other words, why didn't God do something? Why did God sit by and allow that horrible massacre to take place? You see, even a man who is not a Christian, and even a man who is interested only in history and society, even that man feels in his heart that God should have done something. If there is a God, it is incomprehensible that God didn't do anything. You don't have to be a Christian to ask that question. You don't have to be a man or a woman of faith to ask that question. There is built within every human being a certain sense of rightness and wrongness. We are born with a certain sense of justice, and the most heathen of us understand and say, God should have done something. Why didn't God do anything? Why did the heavens not darken? Actually, this man is simply asking the same question that these people asked in the parable that Jesus gave. When they saw the tares springing up, they said to the master, where did these tares come from? They didn't ask where the wheat came from because they knew the wheat was supposed to be there, and that was just accepted. But in among the wheat there were growing these poisonous weeds that looked like weeds, looked like wheat. Sometimes were called wild wheat, but you couldn't tell they were wild until they began to blossom and bring forth. And they said, where did all these tares come from? What they're simply asking is, where did all the evil come from in this world? I think it is interesting to me that when the disciples came to Jesus and said, tell us the parable, they didn't say, tell us the parable of the wheat and the tares. They said, tell us the parable of the tares. But the parable was the wheat and the tares, but the only thing they were interested in was the tares. You know, I hear a lot of people say, why is there so much evil in the world? That's what our concern is. I've never had anybody come to me and say, preacher, can you tell me why there's so much good in the world? Why is there so much evil in the world? We're not amazed and surprised at good. We sing that hymn, Amazing Grace, but it's not grace that amazes us. We think we deserve it. What amazes us is justice. Why is there so much evil in the world? And when something happens, we say, why me? Well, why not you? Why are you any different? We don't acknowledge God in all the good things, but the minute we get in the bad things, suddenly we become believers in God. Some years ago in our town, a young man, a policeman, was killed in a car wreck. He was not a Christian, neither was his wife a Christian, neither were any of his family Christians. They asked one of the staff members of our church to conduct the funeral. He went by to visit the family, talk with the mother and the father and the wife. And as he got ready to leave that house, he simply said, could we have a word of prayer? And when he said that, the mother of this dead boy screamed out and said, no, there'll be no praying in this house. God kill my boy. When he told me that, I said, you know, that's probably the first time she's thought about God in years. I'll bet when that boy was born, she didn't run around saying, God has given me a son. God has given me a son. But suddenly when something happens, now all of a sudden God becomes an important part of the life. Where did all the evil come from? That's a mystery. I'll tell you, it is a mystery that haunts me, and I don't know why it is that I see this so much, and it has become such a message and such a point in the life. But it seems as never before, everywhere I go, I find people living in absolute bewilderment and puzzlement. Why have these things happened? Why doesn't God do something? Why doesn't God do something? Where did all the tares come from? Well, I want tonight not to solve the mystery of good and evil in the world, but I want us to have a little light thrown on it by what Jesus is talking about in this parable. Now, we ordinarily, a great many times, interpret this parable as the wheat and the tares as talking about lost church members, saved church members and lost church members. But the fact is, it has nothing at all to do with lost church members. Because the Bible says the field is the world, not the church. And he says, let them alone. Now, if he's talking about lost church members, he said, don't try to win them. Let them stay lost. Let them stay lost until the end time, and then they'll be burned in hell like everybody else. So we know he's not talking about that. He's not talking about lost church members and saved church members. He's talking about the presence of good men and evil men in the world. He's talking about the presence and the mixture of good and evil in the world. And this parable can throw a great deal of light upon us tonight in understanding and trying to make some sense out of our lives. I've known since I was 9 years old I was saved and was going to heaven. I don't worry at all about that. I have no doubt that if Jesus comes tonight, He'll take me with Him. I have no doubt if I drop dead of a heart attack in the next few minutes, I will be in heaven. I'm not worried about it. My problem is making sense out of my life right here and now. My greatest problem is not worrying about if I'm going to make it to heaven. My greatest battle is trying to make sense out of what's going on in my life and the lives of so many people that I minister to. There are three statements that our Lord makes that I want to build around tonight. He says three things. First of all, in verse 28, He says, an enemy has done this. That's the explanation. An enemy has done this. Verse 30, He says, let them both grow together until the harvest. That's the second statement. And the third one, also in verse 30, and in the time of harvest, I will say to the reapers, let them alone. Let them grow together. An enemy has done this, and in the end, it'll all be taken care of. Three words tonight I want to gather my thoughts around. The enemy, the enigma, and the end. First of all, the enemy. The servant said to the master, we know you sowed wheat. Where have all these tares come from? Where have all these tares come from? Now, during the days of when these words were spoken, the Romans had a tremendous law, one of the laws that said it was illegal and punishable by death if you were to sow tares in another man's field. Because these tares were poisonous, and in growing up you could not tell the difference between them. Only at the end, when the fruit began to blossom and you began to gather them, could you tell the difference. But they were poisonous. It was illegal to do this. Now, it was also well known that in those days, as you sowed your wheat, it was possible that a little tare seed would fall in between. Sometimes the wind would blow it in, and sometimes inadvertently it would become mixed in with the real seed. And every once in a while you would notice there's a little bit of tare growing among the wheat. But what surprises these men is not the presence of it, but the extent of it, how much there is. Lord, He says, where did all this come from? I mean, the field is full of tares. And Jesus gives a very simple explanation. An enemy has done this. And then in those verses He tells us the enemy is the devil. An enemy has done this. He says that while men slept, the enemy came in at night and sowed the tares and then went away. In other words, Jesus is saying, this enemy came in at night when everybody was asleep, and he sowed the tares, and then he went away before the sun came up, so that when the tares began to grow, everybody would think it was just natural. They would never know the cause. They would never know the why of the evil that's in the world. Jesus says this is the way the devil operates. He comes into my field, the very field that Jesus owns. Remember, this is God's field, and Jesus has sown His wheat. But the enemy comes in, and he sows his tares among the wheat. And when Jesus says, let them grow together, or among them, basically He's using a word that means that they are growing in between and on top of. In other words, The wheat and the tares were so inseparably mixed you couldn't separate them without destroying one and the other. I think you can always count on it, friends, that when the Lord Jesus Christ begins sowing His seed, the devil's going to be out sowing his also. The devil doesn't take some corner of the world over here and sow his sons over here. He comes right in the same place that God has done His work, and He sows His seed. And you can always count on it that while God is doing His work and sowing His seed, the devil is also doing his work and sowing his seed. Every time that you have a revival, the devil has a revival. Every time God does something, the devil also does something. During the days of the Lord Jesus Christ, there was an unusual amount of demonic activity. Read the Old Testament, and you'll see very little said about the devil and demons and evil spirits in the Old Testament. But when you come to the Gospels, you'll also find very little about it in the New Testament as far as Acts and the Epistles are concerned. But when you come to the Gospels, I mean the Gospels are bulging with demons and evil spirits and the devil. Why? Because when the Son of Man, when the Son of God walked upon the face of the earth, at that greatest time when the greatest appearance of God ever came on the earth, the devil also was making his greatest appearance. And the reason there was so much increased activity among the devil is because there was increased activity among the Lord. Some years ago, I preached a little revival in a little town in Arkansas, just a wide spot in the road. There were two churches in that town. One was a Baptist church, and the other was a community church. When I got there, I noticed that the community church was having a revival also, which kind of puzzled me because there weren't enough people in that town to have two revivals. Hardly enough to have one revival. I couldn't understand why they have a revival the same time we are. The pastor said they always do that. They always do that. They don't plan them, but every time we announce a revival, they get one going too to compete with us. And I believe that every time God works in the church and every time God works in the world, you can always put it down. The devil's out there sowing too. But see, what he's doing is he is trying to create it in such a way that men don't have an explanation for the evil that is in the world. And what Jesus is telling us is this: evil is not an accident. Evil is not an illusion. Evil is not the imagination of some man's heart. Evil is the result of the enemy of man's soul doing actual work. Whatever is wrong in this world tonight is here because of the enemy, the devil. Now, that's all I'm going to say about that, because we all believe that. We all understand that and accept it. The point of the whole parable comes to this second thing, the enigma. Now, when the servants of the master saw the tares growing in the field, they said, "Lord, do you want us to go out there and separate them and dig up the tares?" Now, that is the expected and normal response. I mean, that's what you would do. That is the right agricultural thing to do. That is the right moral thing to do. That is the right spiritual thing to do. It just makes sense. If I'm having a garden and I see there that weeds are growing up and the garden's choking out the good, the first thing I'm going to do is to go out there and start weeding out that garden. That just makes sense. Everybody knows that's what you're supposed to do. That's the normal, accepted thing. And when you see evil in the world, the normal, expected thing is to do your best to get out of it and to get rid of it. That's what everybody would expect. But notice what he says. No, don't do that. Leave them alone. For in trying to pull out some of the tares, you'll pull out some of the wheat also. Let them grow together until the time of harvest. And this is where the message is. Let them grow together until the time of harvest. Jesus is saying, let good and evil grow together. And they become so intertwined that sometimes you can't tell one from the other. But everywhere you find wheat, you will also find tares. And the mystery of mysteries is why God allows good and evil to grow together. But they do. You cannot separate them. In your life, in my life, in our world, there's always going to be the good and the bad growing together. You cannot separate from your life just the good, and you cannot separate from your life just the bad. You cannot have in your world good only. You have in your world also bad and evil. They grow together. They grow together. And every good thing in my life has bound up with it something that is bad and harmful and tragic and evil. Always. It's that way. It's that way. You say, preacher, that's mighty discouraged. You're having a very negative approach. No, it's very realistic. This is exactly what the God is saying to us in the Word. And I think if I can understand what the Lord is trying to say to me, it might help me to understand what God's doing in my life. The good and the bad grow together. They are intermingled, so mixed that sometimes you can't tell one from the other. And this is the way it always is. You have your children that bring so much joy, but at the same time, they bring heartache, good and evil mixed together. Here is a person who has so much talent and ability, but yet that same person has so many destructive features in his own life. You make a study of the great men and women through the ages, and you'll find something almost without exception that is there, that every one of those exceptionally great people also had a terrible destructive force in their life. In the very same place you find blessings, you'll also find cursings. The good and the bad grow together. It's a puzzle to us. This past summer, my wife and I had an unusual experience. One day she'd been out shopping and she came in, and when she got home she looked and realized that her watch was gone. And she said, "My watch is gone." It was a watch that I gave her on our 30th wedding anniversary. And it was a beautiful watch. It cost a good little bit of money, but I felt like 30 years of marriage, she deserved something like that. But she said, "I don't understand. I just had it on my wrist." And she went back to all the stores she had been to the mall, put ads in the paper, hoping that somebody would turn it in or report it, but nobody did. It was gone. But it was insured, and so we got the money for it, but that didn't really matter. It was the sentimental value that was attached to it. Well, a couple of weeks later, we were in Las Vegas, Southern Baptist Convention. I had a gold bracelet that my wife gave me for a wedding anniversary. It was also insured, but the money was not important. It was the sentimental attachment to it. And we went to the Southern Baptist Convention, went to the pastor's conference on Sunday night. When I got back in my room, I looked up and my bracelet was gone. And we went back over there, retraced every step. We called the security in the hotel, and we did everything we knew to do. But my bracelet was gone. And like I say, it was insured. I called my insurance man, and I said, "Have they canceled us yet on that other claim?" And he said, "No." I said, "Well, I've got another one. I've lost my gold bracelet in Las Vegas." He said, "I don't know how I'll explain that to the insurance company." And it depressed me. It really did. A week or so later, we were in Colorado Springs, Colorado, in a Bible conference, and I was preaching Sunday morning in a little church there. And my wife had a gold chain with a little diamond down here that I gave her for her 40th birthday. And she's never without it. And she has a habit when she sits around to kind of fiddle with it like this. So while I was preaching, she reached up and fiddled with it, and it wasn't there. Gone. We looked everywhere. Looked out in the car, looked in the room. No telling when it came off. She said it's probably laying in a restroom, some McDonald's somewhere, or in some parking lot. Oh, that depressed me. I called my man again, my insurance man again. I said, "Have they canceled us yet?" He said, "No, not yet." I said, "I got another one." Within the space of a month, lost 3 things. I was so depressed that night. I couldn't even sleep. Kay went on to bed and went to sleep, and I sat up till about 3 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't the money, because we had the stuff insured. I don't know. It was just a sentimental value. I mean, I'd given that to her for her 30th wedding anniversary, for her 40th birthday. She had given me that as a wedding present, and it meant something. It was so special. And it just depressed me. Well, about 3 a.m., I finally went to bed. Kay was already asleep, and she was laying on her back with her arm out like this. And so I got in bed, and I picked up her hand, and I held it there for a moment. And all of a sudden, I began to think, and oh, just as easily and just as surely as I lost those things, how could anybody lose a watch and not know it? How could anybody lose a necklace and not know it? How could it just slip off unnoticed? And I said, just as surely as I've lost those things, I'll lose them someday. That's a fact. That's a fact. Sometimes at the most exciting moments of my life, does this ever happen to you? Maybe you got your kids around, y'all having such a great time. Maybe it's Thanksgiving or Christmas, and oh, you're so happy, and all of a sudden there intrudes into your mind the thought, it won't be like this forever. Does that ever, am I the only one that gets thoughts like that? That lives with us, doesn't it? It lives with us. It's a curse. It lives with us constantly. The very thing we love, we know one of these days time is going to come and take our love away. Everything we have and everything we love someday will die. We live with that knowledge. And every time I'm having such a wonderful time and I'm so happy, I can't help it. Sometimes the thought intrudes, well, it won't always be like this. One day death will come, take this one away and this one away. And you're just as helpless as you were in losing from losing those diamond things. And I lay there that night holding her hand. And then she began to snore. The wheat and the tares. The good and bad. Don't run them together. But isn't that so? I remember standing over the crib when our first son was born, and standing over that crib and saying, God, make me the kind of father I ought to be. Lord, thank you for this life. Thank you for this life. And yet at the same time there was that fear. Now that I have something more to love, there's something more to lose. Good and evil together. You say, oh, I just want the good. Maybe there'll come a time when there'll only be good stuff coming. And all the evil will be taken care of. No, good and evil until the end of time, until the harvest, good and evil are going to be mixed together. And the trouble with some of us is the reason we are so injured by things is that we believe that somehow if we just knew the answers, if somehow we had just been the kind of person we ought to be, we could have winnowed out the tares and had nothing but good. No. Try as you may, work as hard as you will, pray as much as you want, believe all you want to do, but until the harvest, God says, let them grow together. This means that there is a judgment that is beyond my own judgment. You say, what do you mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is that I have a judgment. I judge things. Here is something that's come into my life. Here is a situation. Here is a circumstance. Now, I'm sensible enough. I'm smart enough. I'm old enough. I think I'm a Christian enough to evaluate these things, and I bring a judgment on them. But I must remember that there is a judgment beyond my judgment. The judgment of those servants was, let's get rid of the tares. Oh, there was a judgment beyond their judgment. That was the judgment of the master. He said, oh no, let them alone. Let them alone. And so I look at the experiences and circumstances in my life, and I pass judgment upon them. I say, this ought not to be. This needs to go. And I may be right or I may be wrong, but I need to always remember that there is a judgment beyond my judgment. I think it's important that we understand that good and bad run on parallel tracks and usually arrive about the same time. Now, the way I've always looked at it, the way I've always thought about it, was that right now there's a lot of good coming down and there's a lot of bad coming down, but boy, one of these days when I get all the numbers, all the right buttons punched, one of these days it'll be nothing but good coming down the pike. Right now, there's some bad things coming down, and so I'm having to put my life on hold. And as soon as I get past this hump, then I'll really get down to living. When my son was in seminary, he has a problem with the colon, and any kind of stress or pressure just causes him great pain, gets terribly sick. One semester he'd been sick so much, he'd missed so much school, he said, "Dad, I'm going to have to drop out. It's better to get an incomplete than F." So he dropped out. Started back next semester. Got sick again and was talking about maybe having to drop out. I said to him, "Son, you're going to have this problem all your life. It's going to be there all your life. You cannot stop what you're doing every time this comes up and happens. You can't take off and put your life on hold until this passes. You're going to have to discover right now whether you can live with it. Because you can't, if you stop every time, you'll never finish. You've got to discover right now whether or not you can do your job with it, because you're going to have it." And I know so many times in my life, my maybe unconscious attitude has been, well, you know, things are so mixed up right now and things are so confused right now that boy, when I get my kids grown, I'll really begin to get on with my life. As soon as we get this bill paid off, as soon as we get past this bear, then we'll really be able to get on with our life. Somebody told me not long ago, life is what happens while you're waiting for life to start. And that's a pretty good definition. And I think that so much in my own life, the reason that I've been so bruised and so wounded before is because I didn't understand this. I had the idea that if I came to a certain point in my Christian life, there'd be nothing but good coming down. Nothing but good coming down. That is not so. Good and bad run on parallel tracks, and they usually arrive about the same time. Kay and I have dear friends, some of the best friends we've ever had. They had a daughter that they loved, of course. And one day this daughter met a boy and began to become interested in him. But the parents felt like this boy had some real character flaws and defects. And they talked to their daughter about him, you know, like parents will do. But it seemed that the more they talked about him, the more determined she was to be with him. That's the way it happens. And she married him. And unfortunately, the parents were right in their estimate of the boy's character. A few years later, he up and left her, abandoned her with 2 little babies. I've never had anything like that happen to me, one of my children. I don't know how it hurt. I cannot imagine. But I saw what it did to this mother and dad. We walked with them through it many a time. They shed tears. And not only that, but he was a minister too. And folks, I want to tell you something. That adds a little bit extra burden to it, because everybody thinks ministers ought to have everything right. Their kids ought to be right. And if something goes wrong in their family, they say, well, sort of a hypocrite, wasn't he? So there's the added burden of that. They not only had the heartbreak of what had happened to their child, but also the stigma that comes from something like that. I remember saying to Kay one night, I'd been thinking so much about it, and they'd had so much other heartbreak in their life. I don't know why some people have so much. I said, you know, I'd give anything in the world if I had the power to reverse that. And I fantasize that way once in a while. If I were God, If God would just let me be God for a day, I'd give anything in the world if I had the power to go to that mom and dad and say, Mom and Dad, listen, God has given me the power to back everything up. I can reverse the whole process. I can make it where your girl will never meet that boy. They'll never fall in love. They'll never be married. He'll never abandon her. You will never go through this heartbreak. It will be as it had never happened. I can do that for you. Would you like for me to do it for you? Oh, I might need to mention one other thing. You do realize, of course, that if I do this, you'll have to give up those 2 grandbabies. Now, folks, I'm not a grandfather. I don't know. Some of you are. You tell me. What would you do? No. No, you're not going to take those grandkids. Let me ask you something. How in the world, then, can you so glibly and lightly and simplistically say that everything that happened in that experience was bad and evil, when out of it came 2 lives you'd die for? You can't separate the good and the bad in our lives. Let them grow together, he said, until the time of harvest. What God needs to help me to understand is that thy case is not special, that there's not something wrong with me, that I'm not under the judgment of God because there's something bad coming down, that's just natural. That's the way life is. That's the way it is. The third word, the word end. Jesus said, let them grow together until the time of harvest. And then in the time of harvest, the reapers will come, the angels will come, and they'll gather them all up, and they'll separate them. They'll burn the tares. 3 statements I want to make very quickly. Number 1, tares don't bother the master. Did you catch that? Did you notice that? The servants came in all upset and anxious and said, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? He said, let them alone. Let them alone. Tares didn't bother him. Folks, I want to tell you tonight, all the evil that's in this world doesn't have God anxious. God's not losing sleep over what's happening in this world. The tares don't bother or disturb the master. The second thing is, it's still his field. He is still sovereign Lord of the field. The devil couldn't have sown the seeds if God hadn't allowed him to. I know that raises other questions that none of us can ever yet answer, but I do know this. I don't know the how and the whys of all this, but I do know this. It's his field. And he's still the master of this field. The third thing is a question. Why, now listen very carefully, why didn't the master allow the servants to root out the tares? Why? What was the reason? Come on. Root up the wheat. You know why the Lord let the tares stay there? It's better for the wheat. Now, folks, I don't understand it, and I can't explain it, but I do know this, that the only reason the master allowed the tares to stay and grow in the field was out of his concern for the welfare of the wheat. And I'm going to tell you something. The evil, I'm not talking here about sinful evil. I'm not talking about when you and I just go out there and sin against God. I'm talking about the natural evil that is simply in the world as a result of the fall that you and I have to live in. I want to tell you something, folks. If you know Christ and you're part of the wheat, the tares will not hurt you. Take the Master's word for it. You're better off with evil in the world than you would be without it. Because it is by antagonism and opposite pressure that you and I grow and develop. Jimmy said a moment ago, if God removed every problem and God removed every difficulty, there would be no need for God. And that's true, and I'll tell you something else. If God, every time His child got into a discomforting situation, if God changed everything, made everything nice and rosy, you would be raising an adolescent who would never know how to face life for himself. You don't help your kids by solving all their problems, do you? And making things easy for them, do you? I'll tell you what, not anything harder in the world for me to do than stand by and see one of my kids hurt when I know I could bail them out. But I know this much, that if life is all roses for them, they'll never amount to a thing when they get older. They won't have a bit of ounce of strength or courage in them. Good and evil run on parallel tracks, and they usually arrive about the same time. But it's only God can do this, can bring good out of the evil, and is able even to make the wrath of men to praise God. Let them alone. Let them grow till harvest, and then leave it all till the end. Why don't we do that? Why do you drive yourself crazy trying to figure it all out? Why drive ourselves mad trying to understand and explain and excuse and trying to wonder why everything is like it is? Folks, just leave it to the end. Just leave it to the end. You'll never know anyway until the end. It'll never be changed anyway till the end. Don't waste your life. Don't ruin your life worrying and driving yourself crazy with anger and frustration trying to figure out the ins and outs of it. Leave it to the end. Just be patient. Now I want you to bow your heads for a moment as we pray together.